This is Real Estate Real Talk, a weekly podcast about real estate industry news that actually matters, hosted by some of the industry's leading agents. Here are this week's hosts.
Welcome to the Real Estate Real Talk podcast. This is episode 3 in our series on AI tools for real estate agents. We're excited to have Tim Kinzie as our guest today. Tim, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a quick version of your real estate journey?
My name is Tim Kinzie, and I'm recording from my home office in Cary, North Carolina. I've been in real estate it'll be 15 years this January, and I think CRS designation I earned probably a good 8 to 10 years ago. I probably started using AI the same way that everybody did. I was actually at a UFC fight with a good friend of mine, and on the way, we were talking about how there's this new thing called chat something. He was just starting to interact with it, interface with it, and he was talking about how it was really surprising him how accurate it was. This was years ago. This was probably 3 years ago. He's an attorney, and so he was noticing that it was something that was actually fairly accurate. It wasn't perfect. Obviously, AI isn't, but he was starting to project forward in his mind a future where a lot of his skill set and a lot of law would sort of be obsolete. And he was both excited about that and also kind of freaked out. And so when I have people that are educated and very good at what they do in their fields telling me about an emerging technology that was that easy to utilize and that it was sort of creating that response, I started dabbling with it. Gosh, this might have been around the first or second model. I think we're up to 5 now. And first, second model or whatever. And my first instinct was to start asking it real estate questions because I was just curious. I'm like, all right, well, if this guy is giving it credit for legal interpretation, then I wonder how it would do for real estate stuff. It's obviously very limited, but it was still very exciting for me as someone that teaches this stuff to recognize that it has no sentience. It's not actually thinking through anything or truly reasoning through its own intelligence, but it's basically scrubbing the internet and everything that we've sort of developed in that space, and it draws from all of that. And so it was really cool to ask it questions as a layperson and kind of see what it said. And it was actually, in broad strokes, it understands the spirit of what we do in a lot of ways, but it falls apart when you get into nuance and obviously specific scenarios or laws and stuff like that. But that was the road. And since then, it's been something that, whether or not we want to, it's a hype thing right now. And there's obviously value in a huge market that's emerging from artificial intelligence. And so I interface with it daily, not necessarily creating any type of dependence, but it's something that everybody's utilizing. So it's important in my mind to not only utilize something like ChatGPT or Grok or Gemini or whatever, but getting into other types of tools like Perplexity for research purposes or whatever. And it gets into content creation territory when you start talking about Midjourney and those types of services when, you're creating art or whatever. So I would say that, like a lot of people, AI is now a tool that I've using and leveraging in a lot of different aspects, but not in some type of like ninja samurai secretive way that I would be uncomfortable with sharing with everybody, which is why something like this is so cool to do, because there's just a lot of really novel and interesting ways to use this tool as a force multiplier. That's why it's fun to talk about and learn about. So hopefully people get value out of this whole discussion because there's just a lot to share. I'd love to say something really impressive and self-aggrandizing, but the truth is that it's actually quite simple. Real estate is a really interesting industry, especially residential real estate brokerage and sales, because we don't possess any of the inventory. And it was always really surprising to me when I was new to the industry and the business that there were brokerages and stuff that had a lot of overhead expense. A lot of these larger companies and firms, fundamentally, they're all franchises, like in the vast majority of cases, and I won't name any names. This isn't derogatory. This is just the reality of a situation. But like a large national firm that has 100,000 agents on its roster, part of their franchise agreements include, needing to procure office space and things like that so that they can put up their brand elements and create, ancillary services through their desk fees, et cetera. And what that does is it creates a lot of overhead expense in an industry that really has no overhead. One of the reasons why I wouldn't personally start a restaurant isn't because restaurants are bad businesses. They're actually some of my favorites, but the margins are so tight in that industry that it's something that I've never really been comfortable with pursuing, as an example. Now, the polar opposite of that would be getting financial consideration for executing a skill that is purely information based. So real estate agents, fundamentally, there's not a ton of overhead in how we operate. The overhead is artificially created through things like split arrangements, royalties, and that type of thing. And when I was building a company, I realized that there are a million factors that agents look into when they decide who they want to work with. And one of those is just, in the most simplistic terms, value. I'm a proponent for paying any type of sort of compensation split scenario if you're getting justifiable value from that. For example, if you worked with a brokerage and they gave you 100 transactions a year, it's okay if you're making maybe 20% of a sale if your entire sales process, client acquisition process is totally automated. That's a pretty fair trade. But as you go down the value proposition line, things can break down if they're not actually giving you enough business to justify that expense. One of the first barriers that I figured, just as like a 25-year-old kid who was in a big company and trying to figure out why I was paying 50 to 70% of my commissions to a brokerage that I wasn't really even having conversations or learning from. I started wondering, like, why is that? First question was, does this make sense for me? And the second thing was, is this margin for the business? Where is the line where they are profitable and how much of this is truly necessary? And when you start peeling back the onion, you realize every brokerage has to have some type of split arrangement to justify the risk of bringing somebody onto their roster. There's a lot of resources and time that goes into training people, assuming they're doing that. But there's also margin. And the more you eliminate the overhead expense, you can preserve margin without having to take larger chunks of money from your own agents. So this idea was that, you know what, if we were able to create the systems and our training distribution and a lot of the components of the brokerage that were traditionally done in person, physically in offices and stuff like that, we were able to distribute through a web platform where we were conversing with our agents in situations like this and producing on-demand video content training, then we can eliminate our brokerage's overhead expense and need for, space and all of those other things. And we could pass those savings along to the agents that join the brokerage while also maintaining the margin that the bigger brokerages had. So it was just an efficiency thing. It was just cutting out what I deem to be the non-essential overhead expenses in the model and just creating really cloud-based on-demand training infrastructure and communication stuff that we could use as a placeholder. I didn't invent the technologies. I'd love to say that I did, but that's not the case. We just realized that there was a niche for people that were tech savvy, over 10 years ago that would appreciate having high-level training and access to these things without that overhead expense. And we were able to grow really rapidly as a result. And, now we're national, even though we're a boutique, wager that the amount of time and energy that it takes for me to administrate and run this company and the amount of risk exposure that I have as a result is significantly less for the type of income that I earn than most people that have teams that are 10 times larger. It's like 10 times less pressure and stress and overhead and risk exposure for the same amount of money. It's just something that we saw early and has only been validated more and more as time goes on. That's just a happy accident in a lot of ways. I'm very grateful that we figured that out.
You mentioned you do a lot of virtual trainings. How do you use AI to save time and money with that and other parts of your work?
Without getting into a comprehensive list, because as I go into them, I'll think of so many things. Man, I should have shared that one. But right off the top of my mind, one of the things that I love utilizing AI for, especially internally, is just streamlining preparation and administration for creating outlines for conversations and content and things like that. For what it's worth, when I am brainstorming some type of training or idea or session or meeting or whatever we have going on as a team, I like to just stream of consciousness write and not worry about formatting, not worrying about chronology or anything like that. I just want to get this sort of idea that's stewing inside of me out onto paper and then turning that raw data into some sort of sensible outline that we can kind of go through chronologically and categorically address, kind of like this interview in a lot of ways. That's extremely helpful because I tend to be a perfectionist and I like to be precise in the things that I'm communicating. So if I'm just sit there and left to my own devices to structure a training plan for a day, I'll take 6 hours because since I'm writing it, I want it to be as great as possible because I feel like it reflects upon me. But if I'm supplying ideas and actually just outsourcing the organization of that data to AI, then for some reason there's like a mental switch that flips, and something that used to take me 6 hours takes me 15 minutes. And that's been such a massive productivity boost because it just allows me to get out of my own way. And I think that that's something that if more people understood that, I think that it would, especially type A perfectionist minded folks, I think it's just a really great way of looking at your ideas and having the validation and the satisfaction of knowing that your ideas are strong. Maybe your writing skills or your ability to like project manage and implement those in some type of order, maybe that's not a strength of yours, like it isn't for me, but it allows you to have sort of the best of both worlds. And that's something that we utilize constantly. Another thing that we do internally is we'll have AI we'll say, hey, I want you to come up with like 10 questions that are the most common Google searched real estate questions for this month. And then we'll do a podcast internally where staff will just ask me those types of questions and I'll answer them. In the past, we would crowdsource a lot of stuff. So maybe we would talk to clients or colleagues or agents in the office and then try to generate questions based on whatever is occurring to them. And we still do that, obviously, because there's a lot of tremendous value in that. As you're creating content and putting together this podcast, it can be kind of hard to have enough content to tell the story or complete the thought or the message that you're trying to share. AI gives you a fairly inexhaustible source to draw from that we utilize often. And, I can go on and on and on about what we do internally. Some more high level technical stuff is we had a project recently where, I've been doing this long enough to where at certain point, even with the cloud-based brokerage, we had paper transaction filing requirements, especially in the state of Colorado that I started the companies in. Data entry is a really important role historically to kind of turn dumb data into actionable intelligence. And that used to require somebody looking at files and transcribing them or transposing them onto another medium. But we were able to just take snapshots with a cell phone, have the AI pull the data that we were looking for, upload it into a database, and something that would have effectively probably been cost prohibitive, we were able to do in less than a week, so that we had all the information from past clients and stuff uploaded into our, newer CRM systems, just so that we had a way to stay in touch with these folks. And on that note, I'm sure we'll get into there as we go through the conversation, but I try not to let AI make decisions about who we should be communicating with or the communication in general, because I feel a lot of that stuff should still be organic and based on, like your instincts and the way that you truly value a relationship. But there are aspects to sales that benefit from drip campaigns and sort of more touch-based, data-driven decision-making. AI is obviously in some form or fashion for a long time now been useful in that regard, but it's only accelerating now that AI is able to make better insights and help you make better decisions as a result too.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really informative. Can you give an example of where AI has deepened trust with clients and where you could see there's potential for AI to actually damage it?
That's such a good question. I'm not sure I could identify a truly profound moment where AI was able to progress a relationship or strengthen a relationship. This kind of goes back to what I said in that magazine article where real estate this is sort of hyperbolic, and I'm not in the mood to get into debate about this with other industries, but real estate really is, it has always been a very relationship driven industry and business. And I don't know, you can't outsource caring about people to AI. You can't outsource insights or instincts to communicating or working through or solving problems that truly matter to them specifically, because they just don't know those people, obviously. I could say in a sort of indirect way that I've been able to use AI to analyze trend data, looking at CMAs and things like that, not as a replacement to analysis, but just as a supplement to make decisions based on price and a million other factors to just get that little bit of extra assurance that the decisions that I'm making when I'm, say, listing a property or writing an offer for a property, it's just another data point to point to help a client understand the amount of time and effort and energy and double checking of work that goes into advising them to make some of these very important strategic decisions. I'd say that, again, we'll probably talk about this later in the conversation, but that is something that could be abused really quickly. I think one major thing that I want everybody to understand as they listen to this message is that you want to be careful how much you outsource to AI, because it really is a force multiplier, but it has very obvious shortcomings and inaccuracies that could be a massive, massive issue in the context of a real estate transaction where precision really matters. AI represents a speed advantage, and in some ways, from a compute standpoint, a productivity and output advantage. At this stage of the technology, on September 15th, 2025, it cannot outsource your own instincts and intelligence, and it will make mistakes. And I've seen them. I've seen them live on the MLS, and it's shocking to me that people they're abusing it. I guess that's the point. And I don't mean to say that to condemn other people. I get it. People, I don't think, have any malicious intent when they're doing this, but it is something that I've seen. And I think that it's something that people need to be aware of. Again, it's a force multiplier if you use it correctly, but it could also be a problem multiplier if you're not careful.
What do you see as one of the biggest ethical risks with how real estate agents are adopting AI now?
Another great question. I'm really excited, by the way, for people to learn from this content. I legitimately hope it's useful to folks, because there are things that I've currently identified, and then there are things that I could theorize that I'm sure exist in terms of issues that are proliferating as we speak, but I couldn't point to any egregious single example. And then there are the things that we can imagine in the future that are kind of insane. And then there's the stuff that we don't see coming, which is always really interesting to me. But I'd say that one of the major issues, and as a person that works in the creative industry and is obviously responsible for crafting messages and articles and content and those types of things, I worry about plagiarism. And I don't even just caution people to think of plagiarism in the direct rip off of someone else's idea, but also the misrepresentation of their own ideas and ingenuity and insights. It's really easy right now, until you have an interaction like this, to pass yourself off as having expertise in an area or in a specific situation that you really don't. And I think that that is something that people really need to be honest with themselves about and have some integrity and forethought, because right now there aren't really checks and balances that allow people in real time to understand whether something was AI created or not. And so there's a lot of disclosure that is purely optional in a lot of senses that I feel like should be mandatory just from a self-preservation standpoint. So I can only speak for myself in this situation. I know that I'm not alone, but I spent a lot of time crafting and creating content, coming up with concepts that in organizing ideas and packaging things that really are from my own mind and life experience. There's a tremendous amount of value in being capable of having the ability to organize that experience and the advice that we package and deliver it to somebody, because that is what people are ultimately hiring you for. It's not necessarily your ability to pass yourself off as an expert at something. It's to understand that we are chunking information. When somebody's truly an expert at something, they have pattern recognition that they color with the context of their own experience and their ability to communicate and identify and problem solve. And that's what they're looking for. They're not just looking for front-facing information. They're really interested in the back-end underlying principles of what you actually understand and represent. All that to say, when you're producing content and any even seemingly insignificant part of that is AI driven, I think it's very important to disclose that, because in the future, when there is a way to retroactively determine whether or not something was done truly inspired by yourself and written by yourself or something that was AI assisted, I think that that poses an ethical dilemma and also a potential liability situation, because you're not who you are presenting or representing yourself to be. I think that's something that is important for people to consider. Now, that might be easy for me to say as somebody that's got a huge advantage in a lot of ways from a business acumen standpoint and experience standpoint. Certainly a newer agent, this is just common sense. They just don't know as much as the truly effective elite 1%ers know. Like a CRS in general is a pretty successful agent. Just even reaching that threshold is a wonderful accomplishment. But then there's tiers of success within that really small group of achievers. And I just think that it's important for people to self-represent accurately. And if you're going to use AI and take all of these wonderful insights and figure out a way to combine them and communicate them and package them with your own ingenuity, then Godspeed, go for it, do that. But just don't represent it as coming from your own mind, because even without the ability to run it through some type of scrubbing system, people can recognize AI communication patterns already. And I think that for the truly savvy people out there, the best clients are typically the most successful, the most savvy, the higher end stuff. They're going to see through these things and they're going to recognize when they're working with somebody that doesn't know what they're talking about, or in a lot of ways, even worse, someone that passes themselves off as knowing what they're talking about. And then they get themselves in a situation where, you're essentially falsely advertising your capability.
That ties in nicely to our next question. When it comes to working with AI, what does appropriate disclosure look like? How would you recommend or advise agents who want to be transparent when using AI? Are there standards or guidelines that agents should follow?
I don't represent NAR, even though I am a CRS. I don't represent the Residential Real Estate Council, so it's hard for me to speak on behalf of any type of standard that should be implemented. But I've always prided myself in life as being fairly anti-establishment. And I'm about to say something that is like the most cupcake and common sense thing that we're taught from the very beginning when we get licensed. They always talk about disclose, disclose, disclose. I don't know if there is a limit to what I would ever personally want to disclose, because the point of that is to communicate transparency and integrity. And I think that the only types of folks that are unwilling to be transparent are typically people that aren't acting in good faith, just generally speaking, assuming they're doing it consciously. There's a lot of people that might be unconsciously doing stuff and they don't realize that it's a problem, And I think that's where education comes into play, stuff like this, just so we can help people know that maybe they've been utilizing these tools and communicating things, and it's just never really dawned on them that could be problematic, because there's just not a lot of oversight and leadership in every brokerage that exists. Again, I don't want to throw stones at folks, because obviously I don't do everything perfect as a leader, and I certainly don't do everything perfect as a person. But I can tell you that there's a dramatic difference in the type of oversight that different real estate teams or brokerages have. And if an agent is the average agent, they don't really have direct mentorship with anybody that truly investigates or cares about what's happening to them in their career. They're just sort of implementing a strategy that they didn't invent, sharing words that they didn't battle test with somebody that they barely know. And the result of something like that is just too much distance. And therefore, if that's the case, and a person understands that anytime they're utilizing any type of AI technology to sort of leverage their output, it just makes sense to explain when that happens. So there's a lot of interesting things that are AI adjacent that are now bleeding into AI where this comes into play. So I happen to own a film production company, and there are subsidiaries that are a part of that company that include everything from real estate photography, videography, and everything else. Let's just say you're taking a standard photo of a living room, right? And you don't like the way that some of the wires from the TV look on the wall. So you decide to Photoshop out the wires, right? It's not a real material thing happening. You're not trying to add a window or anything psychotic like that. You're just trying to make something aesthetically prettier so that people are more likely to kind of see it in person. In that scenario, I would want to just make some type of quick little footer or something that says that, hey, wires were removed. Just something like that, so that nobody could ever think that we're trying to be manipulative in any sort of egregious manner like that. At a certain point, you take a photo in a cloudy sky and you blue sky render it. Does that require disclosure? You don't see disclosure on that hardly ever, but we do. We usually show a before and an after just for context or something like that. But what happens when you start adding 3D modeled furniture? I can say that with 100% regularity, I do see people explaining that. And even though that's the most self-explanatory thing in the world, it's hey, that's not real furniture. When you're standing in the house, where'd the furniture go? Well, it's just a 3D render. But what happens when people start removing something like an outlet? What if that outlet happens to have a live wire and you didn't know that? I know that I'm getting into really convoluted and ticky-tacky stuff, but the fact that those things could happen is why you should just explain when you alter images or anything with AI. And along that point, but I'm sure that like me and 99% of other people, we've learned how to read Chat GPT writing. You can kind of spot it from a mile away, right? There's a cadence, there's a rhythm, there's M dashes. It's pretty clear when that's happening. And I'll see it in property descriptions all the time. And I don't even have a problem with that. Fine. I wouldn't do it because it doesn't feel bespoke or white glove or whatever, but maybe a person's really bad at writing. I'm okay, outsource it. I get it. However, maybe say something about that in the private agent remarks, just to timestamp it for the MLS. Because let's just say that there was some complaint and the MLS has some type of action committee that's investigating something that you've done. You never want to just have no rationale or reason for disclosure. Like, you just want to make sure you're doing it. So that's something that's important. And even more important is I've noticed on several occasions AI hallucinations in property descriptions. So this is a very elementary example. They're actually more sophisticated than this, but let's say a very clearly 3-bedroom home as having like 5 bedrooms. And this goes beyond like count the office and the basement it's like there's literally only 3 rooms. There is no possibility of screwing this up. And we'd see this historically like 10 years ago where maybe an agent's listing 2 houses that week and they hire an outside writer, or maybe they themselves wrote it on Word and then they copy paste it and they put it on the wrong listing. That's a problem, but that's understandable. But when you are consciously producing content for a house, and let's just say you're busy, either because you're high performing, top producing type of a person, or maybe real estate's like a part-time thing that you've got going on. You just don't have the time and energy or the focus for God knows what reason. We're human beings, stuff happens. And you just try to make something quick. And now you've got a feature of a home that doesn't even exist. And okay, this house doesn't have 5 bedrooms. People aren't going to go and look at a home tour, look at the floor plans, do their due diligence and be like, where are the other 2 bedrooms? You're in trouble now. That's not going to be the issue. The issue is going to be something significantly more subtle, like maybe the voltage rating or something like that in the panel in the garage, or the type of solar panels, or whether or not they're currently owned or leased or whatever, like just anything like that. The second you don't take ownership of the content and the facts, the material facts that are being communicated about a listing, when that is your responsibility, that's your core function, you have a problem. And so just disclose that you used AIs on the off chance that something happens, and you can just say like, hey, I recognize that this is unacceptable, but this wasn't done with any type of malicious intent. And that might count for something in a defense scenario.
That explains exactly the importance of disclosing the use of AI. But it brings up another issue. AI is a great tool, but it can't replace human beings and that extra quality assurance you need. What advice do you have for agents about needing an additional step to review to make sure everything is correct, and even adding the human touch back into these things?
Absolutely. So something that I'm passionate about is competitive poker, right? It's a skill game. There's obviously elements of risk assessment and probability, but it's not like gambling in the same sense that something like roulette is, which is just pure odds. There's really no game theory or analysis that you're engaging in. And I bring this example up because there are online poker games and stuff like that where people will use third-party programs to outsource their decision-making. If the goal is to make mathematically perfect decisions based on odds, it's obviously more efficient to use a third-party program. The problem is that if you have any aspirations or ethics to enter into like live scenarios where cheating and those types of tools are literally impossible to access, like in an in-person game, or in an online competition that's supposed to be in the spirit of doing things, with our minds, the more you outsource, especially at the early stages, analysis and risk assessment and odds calculation and spread and these types of things to a program, the more you're robbing yourself of your ability to develop that pattern recognition and your own sort of mental processing power and ingenuity to do these things yourself. And that is an illustration of what that does to people on the road to developing skills in really anything, but certainly in the context of real estate. If you are automating a lot of your creative writing or analysis or process of any kind, it makes sense on the front end to shortcut to the insight. But if you don't put in the work to arrive at that insight, you're effectively outsourcing yourself to a technology. And something that I teach to pretty much everybody I come into contact with, whether it's real estate or business, is you don't want what you don't want. The last thing in the world that an agent wants is for an AI to be able to do what we do. And this is coming from somebody that I'm not particularly invested in real estate persisting forever. I recognize that every single industry, every single problem that exists can be improved upon. And one of the reasons why agents exist is because the system itself is fairly broken to the point where you need advocates on 2 sides of a transaction to make sure that it's being done properly. So if anything is going to change real estate, it would be AI correcting the core issues with how the industry functions inherently to begin with, not the agent part. So we have a vested interest in, if I'm a new agent, I'm going to double down on trying to understand how to develop the skill as a human being, and pray to God that people actually care about humans handling this stuff, right? Pray to God that there's actually a niche or a part of the business that AI literally can't fix. Yeah, I think that that's something that people need to be cognizant of, is the more you outsource to technology, the less important you actually become. By definition, the less of you present, the less you're actually needed, the more replaceable you are.
Tim, I want you to be able to get into that thought further, but we're out of time. We're going to have to continue this on next week's episode. Please come back and join us next week when we will continue our interview with Tim Kinzie.
Thanks for listening to Real Estate Real Talk. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, crs.com/realtalk, to your friends and colleagues. Please leave us a positive review wherever you listen to our podcast, and be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous episodes. This has been a Residential Real Estate Council production. Join us next time for another edition of Real Estate Real Talk.